So, welcome to this year's edition of the Armand Hammer Art History Lecture. My name is Rinka Stahuliak. I am professor of French and Comparative Literature here at UCLA and also director of the Center for Early Global Studies. The annual Armand Hammer Art History Lecture is supported by a discretionary endowment provided by the late Armand Hammer, an oil magnate who was an admirer of art, especially the work of Leonardo da Vinci, and we owe to him the UCLA Hammer Museum. Although the endowment that Hammer established for CMRS SEGS does not require an annual lecture, the series began in 1999 under the directorship of Andy Kelly as a way of honoring his gift. Speakers for the series are recommended to the director by the Center's art history faculty members, of which I'm very proud to say we have 7 today at UCLA working under the temporal purview of CMRS SEGS. And while we do keep our traditions, and the Hammer Lecture series is now in its 25th year, I welcome you here today on behalf of a transformed Center for Early Global Studies. In September 2021, we changed our almost 60-year-old name from the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, CMRS, to the Center for Early Global Studies, SEGS. Beyond our name, it is our research mission that has been profoundly modified in order to recognize the plurality and diversity of regional world systems and the diversity of our faculty, students, and programs dedicated to the study of various areas of the globe, and to highlight also the comparative study that underlies the research agenda of the center. We chose this term and the name Early Global Studies. Spatial and temporal connectivity are not the premise of the center's work. If they were, we'd of course not be very global. But what is connected and what is the foundation of our globality are the research methodologies that we share. Our name change allowed us to account for what we had not done previously, the fact that one of the world's biggest research centers, dedicated to almost 1,500 years of human past, is physically located in California on the Pacific Rim, at the extreme of the Western world that opens onto the Asia-Pacific and that is connected to the long history of the indigenous North and South Americas. CMRS SEGS respectfully acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honukwetam, Ahihirom, and Eyohinkem, past, present, and emerging. I am grateful that these actions that have been recognized with a 1 million grant from the Mellon Foundation for a Race in the Global Past Through Native Lenses initiative, a grant that we received for this year. Sorry, for the next 3 years, but we received this at the start of this academic year. Likewise, I want to acknowledge the generous $500,000 gift from Arcadia Foundation, which has now allowed us to establish the John W. Baldwin Postdoctoral Fellowship at the UCLA CMRS Center for Early Global Studies. These combined efforts at the center will bring each year between 3 and 5 postdoctoral scholars to campus, reinforcing the study of the periods under our purview. And I turn now over the podium to Lamia Balafresh, who is Associate Professor of Arts of the Islamic World in the Department of Art History here at UCLA, who will introduce our speaker, Suzanne Blier.
Hi everyone, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Suzanne Blier, who is a historian of African art and architecture at Harvard University in both the history of art and architecture and African American Studies departments. She is also a member of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science and a faculty associate at the Harvard Mellon Urban Initiative. Professor Blier's scholarship offers vital, wide-ranging insight on African art and architecture demonstrating notably Africa's impact on both world history and the emergence of modernity. She has many books. To name just a few, I'll mention, in keeping with this very important question of medieval Africa's centrality to global connections and to the rise of modernity, I'll mention the forthcoming book entitled 1325, How Medieval Africa Made the World Modern, which I gather addresses the global historical underpinnings and implications of the famous 1325 Hajj expedition of Mali Emperor Mansa Musa. In 2019, Professor Blier published the award-winning Picasso's Demoiselles, the untold story of the origins of a modern masterpiece. And in 2016, she published Art and Risk in Ancient Yoruba on the artistic production in Ife. Edited books have addressed a range of topics, including race and visual culture and the history of jazz. Her talk today is entitled Patterns of Anomaly in African Ivories. Please join me in welcoming Professor Blier. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. The weather is perfect. It's great to see friends, and it's such a wonderful occasion to be back in Los Angeles. This material is relatively new to me. I gave a lecture addressing some of this in the fall for an Ivory study group, and I thought it would be really important for me to advance some more work on that and to get your criticism of it. So let's jump in. My focus is in part on the ivories, but equally importantly about the impact of elephants and elephant hunting on the economic and social structures that impact art production and other aspects in Africa. And one cannot come to UCLA without thinking of the Fowler Museum and people who are no longer here, people who've moved, and of course the largest book that's been written in African art on the elephant was an anthology by Durer and Ross. And there's certainly any number of absolutely striking works in more recent 19th, early 20th century African art that address the elephant. But in this talk, I'm going to be dividing it into three parts, basically. And it's more addressing the historical issues that certainly when I grew up in the field of African art as a student and then young faculty member, one of the pleasures of the field were there were no dates. I mean, everything was 19th, early 20th century, so we didn't have to worry about that. But since that moment in time, I think many of us are sort of forging backward in time and see if we can locate some of the ways in which the historical construction of these arts and their societies play out. And in a certain sense, this is going to be a travel of sorts through various periods. I'm going to stop in various places, but the bulk of the material will be focused largely on Nigeria. Many of us know a fair amount about elephants in Africa, in part because they're so widely represented in historic maps and other contexts. Certainly Swift's jocular idea that for empty spaces on the continent, let's put in some elephants because where there's nothing else happening, at least they take up space. But equally importantly, they become closely identified with trade and with the economic relationship between Africa and Europe and the rest of the world. There are many reasons why Europeans and others were interested in African elephants. Part of it was simply to get the shape right. Part of it had to do with the fact that elephants played a role in war. And part of it had to do with the fact that they were simply exotic. But none of that really is the focus of this particular talk, which is more, as I mentioned, about seeing what we can discern historically within the continent. And I thought I would bring up this. If you have really good eyes, you may notice the date of March 26. At the top, it was something that I found on the web just as I was revising this lecture. And it's basically talking about the potential importance of elephant hunting going back to the very early times, particularly in the importance of water sources. I don't happen to agree with this per se. I think water sources have a lot of other things that are much better, like fish and shellfish, et cetera, protein, which allows one to have an abundance of life. But just to say that elephants are on the minds of a number of people. What I'm going to be focusing on here is to look at the ways in which possibly we can think about the interest in ivory, both in other places in Africa and in Europe, in particular in terms of transformations within the continent that then help to shape the ways that art is envisioned, a kind of network of sorts in terms of the ways that to hunt elephants, you really need a corporation of sorts. You need a group coming together, often from different communities. And then after, if one is successful, and you've got to know the lay of the land very well, and after one is successful, then it becomes the equally important decision about how you divide up the elephant. You've certainly got two tusks generally, and the leader, the chief, the king generally would get one, and the other one would be sold. And then you've got the division of this massive amount of meat. So all of that kind of brings together a different sense of the whole within the African societies which are participating in this. And in a certain sense, I think the elephant really stands for much more than we necessarily give it credit for, particularly as the hunger for ivory is expanded so greatly in Europe, in the Middle East, and even in Asia. It really, I think, has a pretty transformative role. And we can see early portrayals of not only the importance of ivories, but also of actually bringing back live elephants, which feature prominently in various contexts. We can think about just the need and the destruction going back to the earliest times. There's a record around 700 BCE of Egypt importing some 700 tusks from Somalia. In the Roman era, there's a reference in 77 CE by Pliny the Elder, who says basically that there's such a dearth of ivory that they're actually having to resort to India. So the question of elephants and the export of ivory and the trade in ivory is really important. And we can think about the continent of Africa in part from this vantage point. I've often been fascinated with the Garamantes, in part because they pose such a threat to the Romans, or at least are perceived to do so, but also because as the Nile Valley is breaking up, as the Pharaonic era comes to an end, we really get the mobilization and the development of a series of other kingdoms in the continent and elsewhere that are strikingly important. And as we look down in terms of, on the left, the map of the Garamantes and think about what's happening below it in the Jos Plateau area, Lake Chad, and elsewhere, and just the fascination that is happening around not only things such as salt and grain and various ideas, but also ivory itself. And again, just to stick to this historic theme before I turn specifically to Nigeria and the key moments in time when a lot of this is taking place, and potentially the impact locally by the 1500s to 1700s, some 100 to 120 tons of ivory is said to be transported from Africa. And that's about 8,000 a year. And much of this is done, certainly in the early periods, without firearms. So it's a much more difficult process than it might otherwise be. This beautiful baby elephant, I'm going to come back to. It's from Nigeria, but just the attention, I think, to detail is a particularly interesting aspect of it. The medieval period in Europe, the period roughly 11th through the middle 14th century, is the one that had particular emphasis in terms of many of the examples of the importation of ivory. And what's interesting in terms of archaeological work being done at this time is we can see evidence of it, for example, in eastern Senegal, where people have turned up not only ivory and animal skins, but also leather as part of the goods that would have been presumably traded. Here we can see some of the work that's being done in France using the ivory, just absolutely extraordinary works. And then just thinking as we're looking at this, well, what were the trade axes? What were the avenues of trade? And I've been working on a map trying to understand what was happening in Central Africa in this particular period. And I'm going to come back to a site that very few of us have heard of before, called, or rather a kingdom called Gauga, which was incredibly important in this era. And I think that what we're going to be seeing as we go looking at this further is the potentiality for two separate but equally important trade routes. One is, of course, going across the Sahara into the Mediterranean that way. The other goes from the Niger River up the Benue River to Lake Chad, and from there eastward and northward to the Nile, and largely controlled by Christians. So in this particular period, we've got those two sets of centers playing off against each other in various ways. But let's go to Nigeria and take a look at what we're finding in this context. The Nok civilization is one of the well-studied archaeological set of centers in this middle area of Nigeria, with a vast array of really stunningly beautiful terracotta sculptures. And a lot of great archaeological work. From my vantage point, I've never come away really deeply satisfied with what I'm seeing necessarily in those collections, in understanding as much about the society as I would like. But one of the things that jumped out at me as I was looking for materials for this talk was this really beautiful image of an elephant that is Nok in characteristic Nok style. And it made me think about what was it that gave rise to such a situation of artworks of such similar style over such a broad period of time and such a pretty expansive arena, as well as a society in which the artworks are really focused on the elaboration of coiffure, individuation of really extraordinary means, jewelry and other forms. And just thinking about what is it within the Nok area that might have led to some of this kind of expansion of forms and individuation. And one of the things that occurred to me is that possibly a role in the elephant hunt and the killing of elephants, the taking of tusks, and the export of these, whether we're talking about going east to some of the Christian communities and others along the Nile, or whether traveling north, it's not so far, to the former Garamonte areas and across the Sahara. And this is a wonderful work in the Louvre that shows a kind of community celebration, the kind of feasting that might have been done on an occasion such as that. We've got other early examples potentially as well in the Cross River area, where one of the monoliths, these are stone monoliths, that scholars are still working on dating, but some of them, they may be as early as around 200 CE. And one of them was identified as the founder of a community who was a successful elephant hunter. And so a sculpture was made of him and of his wife, and the place where the elephant was felled became the site for the future community in which they lived. And this celebration of the elephant hunter, I think, is an important theme. One that comes back, as we're going to be looking at shortly, but also the idea of people who are successful in life. And there are very few things that I could imagine that would show this incredible dexterity and knowledge, than being able to fell an elephant, which are particularly difficult. We come back to elephants at the very well-known site of Igbo-Ukwu in southeastern Nigeria, not very far from the Cross River area. And for those who don't know, Igbo-Ukwu has recently been redated, actually, to the 11th to 12th century. I forgot to change it on this slide, which is kind of interesting. It makes it coeval with Ife. But here we have an elite elder, possibly a priest king of some sort, the Ezianri, in a burial site. There's also a storage site nearby, and a number of ivory tusks that are part of the burial itself, and several portrayals of elephants, bejeweled elephants. And I here have a Nigerian proverb that probably has nothing to do with the Igbo, but which suggests, again, it's not just the ivories, but also the distribution of the meat within the community and the impact that that would have. But the Igbo are also unusual in many respects because of just the importance of these ivories within the context of this display of power within the broader tidal group of men within the Nri group. And these ivories are used actually as horns. And each of the men, the tidal men, would come with their horn. Those in the past, they actually were skilled at playing the horn. These days, they're preceding another person who does know how to play the horn. But just this is a lot of elephant horns in a context of display of title and the display of status, which suggests, among other things, how important these are locally in defining one's place within the society. And this larger set of issues around the history of ivory, what it means locally, its importance abroad, made me also think about the question of firearms. We've got a really great source, Leo Africanus, who is writing around 1500 of a site known as Gauga, which is just to the south of Lake Chad. It's a massive culture, a kingdom that he says is extraordinarily wealthy. And in this early 1500s period, he mentions that there's a trader, a traveler, a merchant from Damietta, which is in coastal Egypt, who arrives and takes back with him ivory, among other things, but brings to the ruler of this area firearms. This is relatively early, as well as chain mail, which is pretty striking, in part because this is an area that up until the present day, chain mail still remains an important focus of some of the rituals. But it also made me think of the possibility, and here I'm putting this out as a question for all of us, of are there new kinds of armaments that are coming in that are facilitating the hunting of elephants? And I was thinking particularly of crossbows, and I was looking at it and hadn't really thought about the crossbow itself as having a history and a dissemination of sorts, at the same time cognizant of the fact that the Mbuti and other so-called pygmy groups also have a form of crossbow. And I really do not know whether there's an indigenous crossbow versus an imported one, and what are the relative benefits of one for another. But a crossbow really has great advantages, as military figures made clear during the fights, for example, in Spain between the Muslims and the Christians. It's a much stronger force, a much stronger blow and greater distance with a crossbow. So something for us to look at that we haven't really thought about. And here, Leo Africanus talking about the arrival of a horse and royal gifts, firearm, a Turkish sword, and chainmail, etc. And then going back with him with camels, humans, 500 ducats, which is local currency. I'm guessing iron, because that was one of the currencies in this area, and then 100 very large pieces of ivory. And on the left is a photograph of someone from the Bornu area with this chain mail, which I would suggest is coming this east-west route rather than from across the Sahara, because we don't find chain mail in Mali, for example, where it would be quite natural to find. So I want to take a few moments and sort of turn to part two and a more specific case study of an area I know well, the kingdom set of city-states known as Ile-Ife. And I will say, as I was working on this material, I began to see this site that I know really well and have written extensively on in a very new way. Not enough for me to call back the book and say, you know, I retract everything I wrote before, but how could I have missed this important feature? Certainly, we do have extraordinary bronze artworks here, including the stunning, nearly pure copper mask of a well-known king known as Obalufon. We also have the palace, and directly opposite the palace is the shrine to Ogun, the god of iron, okay, fine, and the god of war, okay, fine, and the god of the hunt. And as I'm looking at this, and that's right across from the palace, and the key annual event, the only event when the Ani of Ife came out in public, covered with his beaded crown, and walked across to the shrine. I thought, wow, hunting. I'm wondering if there's an elephant component to what was happening. They were certainly creating glass beads, manufacturing very expensive glass beads that made their way through trade all the way north to Timbuktu and elsewhere. They were creating textiles. It was a manufacturing center, probably a lot of agriculture as well. And I'm only pointing these out because these are by far the most famous of the bronzes from this center. And to my knowledge, ivory has not survived. It's a relatively humid area, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't important. One of the things that I discovered in doing the research here is that there were two principal dynasties, one of which was the first dynasty was pretty much overlooked with the establishment of a second dynasty, each of which is identified with a different set of animal avatars and other kinds of idioms. The first dynasty had as its emblem an elephant, as we can see on the two sides of this vessel and in the pendant for King Obalufon. And we can look at some of the sculptures of animals where we can discern very different ways in which the crown diadems are portrayed. So for the example, the ram, which is the symbol for the new dynasty, it's a set of concentric circles, whereas the elephant, which is a symbol for the first dynasty, the oldest dynasty, that may go back to around 900 CE, although most of these arts were made around the same time. There it's a rosette form that figures prominently. And while I wrote about these absolutely stunning quartz and granite and terracotta stools, as have others, and kind of knew that these represented elephant trunks, and none of these are used today, and not because they're not available, but because I think these are first dynasty thrones, so one would not be permitted to do so. But here, the throne, the seat on which royalty is defined, takes the shape of an elephant, and it's that trunk that comes around. So I think that also suggests something about power and elephants, probably as an economic force and something that's going to define basically the hierarchy, the structure of society, particularly as the hunters are getting ready to decide on the various places where they will go after the elephants, but also afterwards when they have to cut up the meat. The other thing that I didn't notice, I mean, I had known of it and I mentioned it, and I even have a photograph, but of these wooden sculptures, these surrogates, these mannequins that are carved into the 20th century to honor successful elephant hunters. And I hadn't paid much attention to them, even though I did a fair amount of work in the grove dedicated to the god Ori, who's the indigenous hunter, as on the right. But as I'm thinking about this, going through this material, I'm going like, wow, elephant hunters, that really is quite remarkable. And here we've got some of the sculptures from that shrine, and a painting on the shrine in the bottom where he's pulling a dog, which is the animal that's offered to the god of the hunt, iron, and warfare. If you go into the palace administrative building, you can see some elephants, although there are other animals that are in play as well. But as I'm looking at the plan of and the layout and the environmental setting of the city of Ife, I realized that it's absolutely perfect, not only for a large, dense population, it's surrounded by water and surrounded by hills. And the water serves as a kind of natural moat. It's really hard, even for cars today. Often the pavement is broken, and you've got to do a slalom, kind of going over as you get through these muddy areas. But it's surrounded by water, and with the hills, they're attracting rain, and that means that you can grow agriculture. So that's going to feed a large population during much of the year. But it also means this is like perfect for elephants. And so it made me think of, how does one organize an elephant hunt? I have been for part of one. When I was much younger, there was an elephant. I was living in a Yoruba kingship in Republic of Benin, and the word went out that an elephant had come down to the fields close to the river, and people were really upset because they just do such destruction. So everybody went out, and very shortly I was way behind and headed back. That was my excitement for the elephant hunt. But what one would need to do is, particularly in a place such as this with mountains all around it, is to find those mountain points between the mountains where you can push the elephants down, sort of herd them down into an area where you're gonna have people, hunters, ready to potentially fell them. So I think that, while we really have not discussed it, I think Ile Ife, which dates in its larger fluorescent era to really the 11th, 12th century, and into right up until the Black Death around 1348. This is the high point for a lot of the interest in ivories in Europe and elsewhere. And so I wonder whether Ile Ife itself isn't part of this expansive ivory engagement. We know of Ife through early maps. It was identified in the famous Catalan map, of 1375 by the name of the title of the king of Ife, the Organe. And as I'm looking back at this map, I'm noticing the elephant here as well. And we can see the reference to the Organe here also on a later map from the mid-16th century. No, is that an elephant? I can't. At the bottom, yep, we've got an elephant at the bottom we can focus on as well. But from Ife, I want to travel with you north to a site known as Tada and some of the nearby sites. And one of the best things that's been written about Ife as a civilization is by the anthropologist Robin Horton, who really does an economic analysis of it. And one of the simple things that he points out is that Ife is roughly positioned halfway between the Atlantic Ocean and the Niger River, and it's kind of taking advantage of both. It's also roughly situated between the forest and the savanna, but it's a site of Tada that's the arrow is pointing to there, which is very close to the Niger-Benue confluence area. And that's one of the most important sort of river sections anywhere in the world for various reasons, one of which is whoever controls this Niger-Benue confluence area controls all of the trade, all of the goods going up the Niger to Mali, and ultimately going down to the Atlantic and then going east to Lake Chad. And during this period, 14th century or so, Ife clearly had control of Tata because there's several sculptures there that were made, as in the figure in the African arts with the green background, made by the same artists who were making the other works at Ife. But this was an important trading site. It was one of the few places you could actually cross the Niger because there were so many cataracts here, and because there were cliffs, it made it rather difficult. But one of the things that one is finding here, sculptures, life-size sculptures and smaller ones of humans, and this beautiful baby elephant, clearly cast from life, meaning modeled from life. It was lost wax method, along with two ostriches, both of which are key figures of trade. And I'll come back to the ostriches shortly. But here we have three. This is a photograph by Philip Stevens. We've got on the right, they're sort of being set out. Usually they're in a shrine temple, and just to suggest the same art source for the seated figure. One of the things, whether you're talking about ivory trade or anything else, is control of the trade routes. And here, Ife was at a great disadvantage. If you're living in Mali and trading across the Sahara, you have the benefit, particularly in this period, of the Islamic faith and the Islamic judicial system, where there's a set code, there's set rules, there's set punishments. One really has, it's a very different set of concerns. I mean, yes, you have to get across the Sahara with the Amatzir and potentials for, getting lost in the Sahara or bad weather. But that was not the same in the Christian world, and nor was it the same as you're moving either east-west from the Benue toward the Nile, or even in the Yoruba area. So it was this group of Ogboni individuals, elderly men, who were charged with not only naming the king and had the power to remove the king, but also with safeguarding trade. And they were the judicial group for anything having to do with trade. So these two figures in copper are at this same site with the elephant. And while we're at it, here we're kind of looking at the Niger River from Tata, vast ships going north and south. I'll just add in parenthetically, many of us know the story of Mansa Musa and his predecessor, who died on a long water voyage. And many people assume it's all over the web. I'm sure it's all over Wikipedia, et cetera. He died in the Atlantic trying to cross to the Americas. I think that that's pretty crazy. First of all, you'd have to go over land to get there. My guess is that they were going east on the Great Water, which is the Niger, to see if they could reach Tata and Ife, which were considered to be as powerful. But I also want to note here that if you're thinking of commerce in this early period, 11th to 14th century, and you have a choice between ivory and ostrich feathers, I would go with ostrich feathers because they're far easier to catch. Europeans are in love with ostrich feathers, and you can just bag them up and then carry them across. And then you also have the ostrich eggs. So this is a subject which has yet to really be explored. All of the ostrich feathers that are coming into Europe during this period, but clearly the site of Tata and whoever was in control of it. I think Ife certainly up until about 1348, 49 with the Black Death, and then Nupe in the years following that. And the final section I want to bring up is what we can learn from some of these ivories and other objects around ideas of anomaly and culture and power. One of the figures I didn't spend so much time on from the site of Tata is a figure that stands about 5 feet tall and is incredibly unusual from the vantage point of the motifs, the elements around it. He's wearing long cowrie shells which are coming from the Indian Ocean. He's got a ram's head pectoral. He's got a horn headdress that extends down the back, which is quite similar, actually, to some of what the Nubian Christian rulers are wearing in this period. But the most unusual thing to me is not only what's on his garment, but also with the crown diadem itself, where we see a kind of version of a gorgon of sorts with snakes coming from the nose, positioned on a disc-like form with an interlace pattern around the perimeter, which is very similar to a lot of textile forms and other forms from the Byzantine era and earlier in Europe. So I think that most likely as part of the trade going back and forth, and I've got equal examples, although I'm not showing them here, of things that are going east, we get this idea of the unusual coming into play through these various forms. And just, I mean, it's quite possible. I wouldn't say quite possible, it's certainly potentially viable that this idea of a human face linked with, in some ways, divine kingship, with serpents coming from the nose, is independently invented in Tada and then in the Yoruba area and in Benin area. But it's equally possible that it's coming from a series of elements from the larger Byzantine and medieval world that are reaching this area as kind of symbols of power. And we can see that in textiles, like the Coptic textiles we can see here, but also in a number of the ivories. And again, I think they open up a number of questions as to what is happening and why is it that these really anomalous, really these unusual forms have such fascination, certainly still today, but also in this time period. And we can see it also in this stunning work from Benin, which shows the king, the Oba, holding aloft two crocodiles, his feet terminating in mudfish. It's a kind of mermaid form, a siren form, but with split legs. And this is a form that is associated with the god of the water, the god of trade, Olokun. You can see it in another Benin work at the top. I didn't put in Starbucks. We all see too much Starbucks, but that kind of derives possibly from the same source. But I have a sense that this is one of those forms that is also appearing in context of protection and trade and transformation in various different arenas, going back pretty early and being communicated probably through small portable objects, if that's what's happening, and possibly also textiles and other forms. So we can see it in Benin on the right. This here is actually much like the earlier one, standing on splayed fish. The Owo example on the right is interesting to me because it was associated with rulership transition. My guess, the one from Kelowna, the siren, probably came in with the Portuguese. There are various moments and this was not found in Nigeria, but it's very similar to some of the forms that one is seeing there. Again, it's not clear what the sources are, but the fascination with these siren, with these sippus, with these mermaid-like forms as motifs that are linked in some ways, not only with transformation, but also power in various ways. And then the final example, in some ways, is the most interesting to me. It's this fascinating Benin mask of ivory, a hip mask of Queen Idia, who ruled in Benin between 1504 and 1550, and is closely associated with transforming the kingdom of Benin in many respects, supporting her son, but also able to play off the Portuguese against the enemies of the state. The Portuguese are arriving here in 1489. And it's well known that there's a wonderful reference in her coiffure where there's an equation on the part of the artist between the Portuguese and mudfish. Mudfish are kind of lungfish that can come seemingly back to life. They kind of hibernate like bears do. but in this case it's called estivating because they do it in earth when there's no more water there. But there's an equation of this transformative and kind of strange set of circumstances with both Portuguese and mudfish. But one of the things that she did that I think is particularly important was to use the Portuguese as mercenaries in part to help with the conquest of the state of Ida in the Igala area, which comes pretty close to the area that's going to control the Niger-Benue confluence area. And so in a sense, I think one of the things that's really interesting here to think about is her personification in ivory, the ways in which the mask itself is referencing the relationship between the transformation of the society, the transformation of the kingship, and the role of the Portuguese in it. And then finally, the expansion of Benin to actually take advantage of the Europeans and gain control of that much sought after area to the north. There's lots of ancillary histories about this mask. The Nigerian government wanted it back in 1976 and the British Museum refused, but they did give them a copper alloy version of it, but it features prominently there. But this whole area also features pretty prominently in the colonial history. And once Benin gets control of Ida, it gets control of much of the taxation that is coming from the north, with each of those canoes getting a certain percentage of the value of the various trips. So that is now coming down to Benin, essentially replacing Ife as the beneficiary of that. And what's interesting as well, I'm going to come back to the map at the bottom in a minute. Benin succeeds in taking over the Igala area of the Niger-Benue confluence area. As a mark of that, the Ida king wears a Benin mask around his neck, much like an Igbo ruler does as well, to acknowledge that particular control of the Igbo area. In Benin, the same thing in Owo. And at the same time, this control of this area really brings to light how critical it was for much of the early trade here. And I'm showing, in addition to these sculptures, an iron chain, which suggests to my mind that there was also enslavement that was part of this. People who didn't pay what they were supposed to pay in terms of funding or loans or otherwise would meet with serious consequences. And this becomes a factor too, particularly this area as we think about the British and their colonial effort, because the British simply didn't come in at the outset with the imagination of taking over the Kingdom of Benin and the palace, the famous 1897 punitive expedition. They went in much earlier and gained control through the Royal Niger Company of the Niger-Benue confluence. And that, I think, is really key, and particularly when one situates it within the huge problems that Europe had in even finding the source for the Niger River, it takes on added significance. This wasn't until late in the 1800s when the actual flow of the Niger was discerned. Up until that point, their sources had said, some had said it flows west to east, others had said it flows east to west, but basically what they were talking about was the Niger and Benue together. So this control of this critical point, which had been of such importance in the trade of ivory and ostrich feathers, was certainly of importance to the British as well, sending up steamships, among other things, as sort of part of the collection of conquest. And ostrich feather trade continues to this day. Watch some of the pomp of the royal ceremony. And ostriches, of course, are not just known for their feathers, but for their eggs, which feature prominently in a whole array of different forms, Christian, Muslim, and otherwise. And they're also the source for one of the other important ivory objects that we're going to be looking at just at the end, which is these ivory salt cellars. I was hoping, looking at Durer's Adoration of 1504, that I would actually find the source as an ivory salt cellar, which is missing. I think instead it was probably an ostrich egg. You can see it here, that was elaborated with metal around it, but both of them are important sources for these wonderful salt cellars that were commissioned by Europeans and positioned on elite tables to define the hierarchy, really, within the context of dining. And these ended up as very prized, very well thought of artworks from Africa that entered into European curio cabinets and collections early on. And finally, I think as we're thinking about culture, whether it's salt cellars and tableware and ostrich feathers for pomp and ivory, it's also important to look at the role of ivory for things such as spoons, and looking at the language about how some of these culinary items are addressed. Early on, it was the Portuguese term for spoon that stuck, and these became, not only spoons became important locally, but also became very valuable objects in terms of trade, again, back with these forms back to Europe. We know a lot about the later sort of decimation of ivory, although clearly it's happened at key moments in time. I would simply point out the really sad correlationship between the coming of culture in the Americas, particularly in North America, in the late 19th century, with the arrival of pianos in every middle-class home and player pianos. Those keys are ivory, and so the need for even greater ivories in the 1890s and 1900s is really quite stifling. And think about just the work, the labor of getting, not only felling these elephants, but bringing these heavy ivories to market. It is really a kind of continuity of sorts within some of the labor practices that were part of the trade. And finally, we can see just in the mapping of ivory and arms and humans that some of the same sort of passages are taking place, whether you're going north, south across the Sahara, or east and west from the Niger and the Benue over to the Nile. So by way of conclusion, I think in looking at ivory, in looking at the elephant as a source of ivory, we perhaps can begin to reimagine the importance of Nigeria, among other places, in fulfilling this need, in part locally, for status associated with ivory, either as horned instruments or as otherwise, but also the role that it plays in each of these different sites. And thinking about at the same time how these anomalies figure so prominently in it, and sort of call the question about how some of these forms are being invested in terms of new kinds of ideas around things such as sirens and gorgons and other forms. And let me just end here. If you want, the bed on the right is available in California. I think it's what all of us need at some point. But even before this, elephants featuring prominently in things having to do with popular culture and, of course, trade. Denmark had an important position in the early trade with Africa as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's time for Q&A. Is this working?
Let me just.
Thank you very much. Okay, are there any questions? Yes, so you have to hold both mics. Is that okay?
But I speak into one?
No, you speak in both.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Suzanne, for a typically rich and inspiring talk and opening so many vistas into a period of African history that a lot of us Africanists don't know very well who work in later periods. So, I mean, there's just my synapses were really firing up. So before I get into my single question, I just wanted to throw out, I forget if it was Colin Turnbull or somebody else who worked in Central Africa among sort of little forest peoples, who showed that so-called pygmies could actually kill elephants quite easily by running and slitting their tendons so they'd fall behind their heels and they'd fall over. So they may not necessarily require a lot of social organization to do them in. But that doesn't mean that that technique was used everywhere. And also a little further west to the Fanti Coast and the Gold Coast of Ghana, another very potent elephant symbol was, of course, and it showed up in one of your slides, the image was incorporated into the logo or the arms of the Royal African Company during the Atlantic slave trade starting in the 17th century. And that gets appropriated on local Ghanaian chiefs, sort of royal regalia and Asafo companies as well. So this is a big thing. My question is, maybe the anomalies are not anomalies if you look at them from another perspective. And that perspective is the idea that central to the logic of so much sacred iconography and so many sort of ritual, the power of ritual symbols, is the idea that a deity that has the ability to attract foreign commodities or foreign products or instruments associated with foreign powers, whether it's Tata, the Mediterranean, or the sirens of the European ships that have, what are those statues on the front of the ships called? Yeah, there's a term. Yeah. So, and I think that's all part of the making of Mamiwata, but you show how early this goes in these Portuguese ivories, and I think the catfish and the Portuguese really sort of reflect the power of these river gods associated with catfish to acquire Portuguese power. So maybe the idea of incorporating icons from wildly different places or not so wildly is simply a very clear case of what is going on at regional and local levels more often, where shrines incorporate gods from conquered people. I know the Cameroons is very strong there. Yoruba does this, where Islamic talismans come in along with images and contemporary altars. You'll get Mercedes-Benz cars. And the idea is that you can mimetically incorporate the image and acquire the prestige and even the object itself with the deity's intervention. So that's my idea there, that maybe the anomaly reinforces an idea of what is not anomalous, that is more homogeneous in a cultural sense, which may represent a continuum rather than a contrast.
Great points. Let me begin with the last. It's kind of what you're suggesting in my reframing of it is kind of like a cargo cult of sorts, with these forms sort of bringing in others, which I think is really interesting. And yeah, absolutely. And I have not read Colin Turnbull in many decades, and that's fascinating. The one thing that I'd be curious about is if geography makes a difference. The heavily forested area, particularly before the Bantu or on the outskirts of the Bantu, it's not going to be that easy I would imagine, necessarily for elephants to get through. I mean, we see them more as savanna animals. 20 years ago, maybe they're still there, that they're not far from Timbuktu, for example. So, and maybe there's a whole different sense of hunting within the context of the environment. You've also brought up something that I hadn't thought about, but I think is really great. It doesn't work for everything, but I think for the later ones, it's interesting. I'll go back to Durer and Ross, who had suggested that the representation of lions in African art derives from Queen Victoria via Mesopotamia. It's not deriving from African lions, and certainly this area, it's more the leopard. But I'm wondering to what extent the elephant is coming back as an important figure in part in relationship to the appropriation of the elephant for trade in Europe. It's a fascinating point.
Yeah, I have a question about, like, it's a follow-up on the anomaly, and it's about hybridization and also indeterminacy. And I'm thinking about Ingrid Greenfield analysis of the saltcellars, of the Sapi saltcellars and the Portuguese interaction, and how the figures, and this is like probably something that could, I'm not an art historian, that's the first thing that could be questioned, but how the figures could be read both as African and Portuguese, and how like that could serve lançados and tangomaos to, if they wanted to also be prominent in African societies or in Europe, or it could help like African rulers. And this is an hypothesis that like is building up onto us believing that there's like hybridity on the figures. So have you found something like that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up her work, among others, and you've actually touched on what at one point was a large debate in the field. I'm not sure if it still is, but the leading early scholar on this was an Italian scholar, Ezio Bassani, who did a catalog at the Center for African Art, and he was arguing, and part of it is correct, that they were using. I'm going to say a word, but it's not the word I want, you know. It's like trade books, pattern books is what I'm looking for, using patterns to create some of the imagery for these. And we've got shields and other forms that are clearly from these pattern books. And in conjunction with the National Gallery of Art exhibition in 1492, I was invited to write an article on something 1492, and these seem to make the most sense. And I was arguing that in part, some of them are actually addressing, from an African point of view, what the Europeans were like, and particularly one can see it in, I don't know how to point here, but in the one on the right, the snakes coming down. So that's not the sort of thing, if I could imagine being at an elite dining table in Europe and getting my salt, that I would like snakes coming down. But I think there are ways in which you can read some of this from that vantage point, and the dog positioned under it sort of barking at the strangeness of it. So I think absolutely there's a real element of that hybridity here that is at play.
More questions?
Thanks so much for your lecture. I had a question about the rise in trade of ivory between the 11th and the 14th century. Do we have any sense of how much ivory in Africa was being exported versus what was being used for the creation of artworks in Africa? And did the rise in the export of ivory have an impact on what they were using to create their own art?
That's a really great and important and thoughtful question. I will put it to the side. I'm going to come back to it to say that one of the major scholars on this is Sarah Guerin, who's at University of Pennsylvania. So that's a great question for her. What I would say is knowing all of the ivories that end up in Europe and even in the Islamic world, and the number of ivories that are still extant in Africa, there's no comparison. There are very few. And of course, we've got Indian ivories and we've got African ivories, and African elephants are larger, their tusks are bigger, so they are privileged in some respect. Now, it's true that ivory does not last that long, although Igbo Ukwu, site 11th to 12th century, there's still enough ivory so that one could discern that it was ivory. And we've got the real dearth in Africa is the number of people doing archaeology. So, but I'm thinking about what we've read about, what one can read about people like Mansa Musa, not much ivory. I mean, it doesn't come in that context. So, I mean, it's a great answer, but I would also say, and I'll say something really controversial and charged at the end of this, I'm kind of curious that the greatest number of works of African art are made between 1890 and 1950. I mean, the museum collections, it's vast. And I'm wondering how much that had to do with, in part, the arrival of much cheaper iron and therefore carving and a whole series of things and a financial well-being. So are there certain changes that are taking place, in part through interrelationships with Europe that are transforming some of what is happening? I mean, it's such a rich field, and there's so many questions that are just not answered. But I would say I think there's a lot more happening in the use of ivory in Europe than probably is happening in Africa. But there are other Africanist art historians here who probably could think through all their collections as well and have another answer, but good question.
We can also continue the conversation over drinks and food on the balcony, right? Is that, yes? Thank you so much again, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.